Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome to the second webinar hosted by the End User Subsidy Lab. We'll wait just a few minutes for some other folks to join us, and then we'll get started. Okay, it looks like we have 35, 36 attendees so far, so maybe we'll jump into it. So hello again, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As I said, this is the second webinar hosted by the End User Subsidy Lab, focusing on the design of demand-side subsidies. And today we're talking specifically about the selection of eligible products and the setting of subsidy levels. My name's Colm Fay. I'm a senior director on the market strengthening team at the Clean Cooking Alliance, and the Clean Cooking Alliance is a new member of the End User Subsidy Lab, joining partners SMAP Lighting Global, NDEV, and Gogla. And just before we get started on the webinar, a couple of housekeeping rules. A reminder just to all of our presenters, if you're not speaking, to keep your mic muted. For participants, we welcome questions at any time through the chat function on the webinar. We'll have our presenters do their presentations and then have some time at the end for a question and answer session. So as the speakers are presenting, feel free to enter your questions into the chat. We'll be selecting and curating those for the Q&A section. We'll also, if there are clarification questions, the presenters may be directly answering some of those questions in the chat. And for any of our colleagues from the End User Subsidy Lab who are on the webinar, please do address any questions that are directed specifically at your individual organizations. I'll go over the agenda for the webinar quickly. To begin with, I'll give a quick overview of the End User Subsidy Lab and the framework that's being developed for the design of demand-side subsidies. Our first presenter then is going to be Philbert Dusenge from the Development Bank of Rwanda, who will share some of the insights and challenges of selecting eligible products and setting the right subsidy levels. In this case for clean cooking products. Then we'll move on to Michael Kelly from the World LPG Association. He's going to share some insights on how these design choices impact the private sector and influence market development and the development of sustainable markets. And then finally, my colleague Pamela Lee from the Clean Cooking Alliance will share some insights on a study that's been conducted in Kenya to determine the most effective subsidy levels for clean cooking products. And just a quick clarification, the projects, the studies, the cases that we'll be showcasing throughout this webinar all touch on clean cooking. But of course, the principles that we're talking about are very much applicable to off-grid solar as well, and the consideration of subsidies in a more general sense. But the cases that we've selected here are focusing on clean cooking. Before we get started, we'd like to get a better idea of who you are. So Brenda, if you can pull up the first poll question. This question is going to be asking you about your organizational affiliation. So if you could just select the answer that's most appropriate. Brenda, if you can, yep. Okay, we have the first poll question up there. So select the option that most accurately describes your organization, government, private sector, NGO, or other. Okay, we just have a few more seconds for that poll question. Okay, I think we have everyone answered. Brenda, if you can show us the results of that. Great. So 6% of our participants from government, good representation from the private sector, 36% of the attendees, 18% from NGO, and 39% from other. Great. Thanks for okay. Thanks for participating in that. So let's move on. I wanted to give a quick overview of the End User Subsidy Lab. The lab is an initiative that aims to promote carefully defined and well-informed end user subsidies through a couple of approaches. First of all, crowding in knowledge, learning from existing subsidy projects, and then creating tools and testing prototypes, and of course disseminating the insights from these activities to inform the design of projects that are implementing subsidies in energy access. As I mentioned, it's a collaboration between SMAP Lighting Global, NDEV, and GOGLA, and more recently the Clean Cooking Alliance. And as part of this work, we're developing a framework for the design of demand-side subsidies. And the webinars, this series of webinars are very, very closely aligned with the design of that framework. The first component of that was the subject of our first webinar. And if you haven't participated in that first webinar back in September, you'll find the recording of the webinar available on the End User Subsidy Lab website. The first webinar focused on identifying and targeting beneficiaries. And the next step then is the focus of our discussion today, selecting eligible products and subsidy levels. And after today's webinar, you'll also find a recording on the website over the coming days. The next step in the framework is the delivery of subsidies, followed by verification and developing an exit strategy for the program. The framework is being prototyped at the minute by our colleagues in NDEV in 4 countries, in Malawi, Uganda, Liberia, and Niger. And we're also developing a subsidy design toolkit with the help of Open Capital Advisors. And we're aiming to launch that design toolkit by the end of the year. So stay tuned for more of those resources that will be coming available before the end of the year. And the discussions that we're having today and all of these webinars will also be an opportunity for you to provide feedback and inputs into this process that we can use to improve these resources. So do feel free to reach out. I'll provide some contact details at the end of the webinar. Do feel free to reach out and share your thoughts on the framework, on its applicability to your work, and any other inputs of relevance. So looking specifically at the second design component and the topic for today's discussion, I wanted to share a quick preview of how we're thinking about eligible products and subsidy levels within the design framework. There's 3 key steps outlined in the draft framework. The first of those is product selection, where the key choice that designers have to make is whether to limit product eligibility to a specific product range, or to consider subsidies for all of the products in a category. In either case, obviously minimum quality standards or standards of performance should apply, and these should be, of course, products that are designed to meet the specific needs of the beneficiaries that are being targeted by the subsidy program. One important consideration when it comes to product selection is that it may support self-targeting. It was one of the options that we talked about on the last webinar, which is the idea that certain products are more likely to be adopted by the targeted beneficiaries, and therefore there's a self-selection element. So, for example, it might be the case that solar lanterns are more likely to be adopted by lower income households, and therefore by subsidizing solar lanterns, the subsidy sort of automatically is targeted towards those households. The next step after product selection is then understanding and assessing the affordability gap, which is essentially the retail price of the product less minus the estimated willingness of beneficiaries to pay for those products. The basis for implementing a subsidy in the first place, of course, is that decreasing the affordability gap will increase the demand for the product, and the optimal subsidy level will maximize that demand while minimizing the cost per beneficiary. And then the last step is setting that subsidy level itself, which might be determined as a percentage of the price. It might be determined as a flat or absolute amount, or it could be some combination of both. And depending on how the subsidy is targeted and what choices have been made about the products that are eligible, there might be a need as well, of course, to differentiate the subsidy level by either product or targeted group. And as we discuss later, and as Michael will touch on, markets may be distorted if these subsidy levels are not optimal, and there's several ways in which that might happen. There's also an important link back to targeting, as I mentioned, when subsidies are accurately targeted to those that have the lowest ability to pay. It may allow, of course, for higher subsidy levels to be provided without the risk of or minimizing the risk of those market distortions. So, moving on to think about the presentations that we have lined up, there's some key questions we'll be discussing, and again, really interested in your feedback and your thoughts on these topics via the chat. Do enter your questions as we go for each of the presenters, and we'll come back to those at the end. So in terms of the topics, we'll be talking about how to approach selecting eligible products and setting the right subsidy level for those products, how subsidy levels that are chosen by a product can create both positive and negative incentives for the private sector, and what are the ways in which markets might be distorted by those subsidies. And then finally, what types of tools can help to determine that willingness to or ability to pay, and how can this inform setting the appropriate subsidy levels. But before we get into those presentations, we have a couple of poll questions. And so Brenda, if you can pull up the first poll question. I just want to get a sense of your thoughts on some of these topics. So first one, what do you believe is the right subsidy level format for a demand side subsidy? First option is a set amount, regardless of the product's price. Second option is a percentage of the product's price. And the third option is a percentage of the product's price with a maximum fixed amount. So I'll give that a few more seconds to let folks add in their answers. Okay, I think we have almost everyone. I'm gonna give it 2 more seconds, and I think we'll end there. and you should be able to see the results of this. So 16% of participants think that we should be thinking about a set amount regardless of the price. 37% went for a percentage of the product's price, and then 2/3 of participants opted for a percentage of the product's price with a maximum fixed amount. So clear preference there. And Brenda, if you can pull up the next question. So when we're determining eligible products and subsidy levels for demand-side subsidies, which factors should we be prioritizing? First of those is providing higher subsidies for lower income households. The second is providing higher subsidies for products that might have better environmental or health performance. And then the third option is providing higher subsidies for higher tier products or higher quality products that provide a higher level of service. So I'll give it a few more seconds for everyone to give their opinions. A little bit over half of the participants. Okay, we're about 3/4, so we'll end it here. So 3/4 of you went for higher subsidies for lower income households, 30%, 31% higher subsidies for products with better environmental or health performance, and the third one, 36% opting for higher subsidies for higher tier or higher quality products. Very good. Okay. Let's jump into the presentations and hear some experiences from the presenters. So Philbert, over to you. We're going to hear from Philbert Dusenge from the Development Bank of Rwanda on some of the insights and challenges from Rwanda's experience of selecting products and setting subsidy levels for the clean cooking component of the Energy Access and Quality Improvement Project in Rwanda. So Philbert, if you're ready to go, we have your slides teed up, and over to you.
Thank you, Colin. I'm trying to share my screen.
I have the slides here, Philbert, so you can just let me know when you're ready to move on to the next slide, and I can advance them for you.
Thank you very much. I would like to appreciate for your invitation, inviting BRT to share experience for the project called Energy Access and Quality Improvement Project, where we are implementing its subcomponent 3B, which is the clean cooking result-based financing on behalf of the government of Rwanda. So we are the project implementation unit. And I will be sharing our insight on the subsidy level settings. So we believe from our experience, we have something to share. And so without taking much time, I would appreciate if you move to the next slide. So I will be presenting 4 points. Point A, the project overview and background, project implementation structure, subsidy level settings, and any other businesses. Next. Next. So as I said earlier, this is a government project, the government of Rwanda project financed by World Bank. The total financing is $20 million, where 17 million is for the matching grant, basically the subsidy to address the cost affordability of different clean cooking technology solutions, and 3 million for the technical assistance. So basically, at the side of the Development Bank of Rwanda, we are mainly, though we are the PIU, we are mainly managing this component of matching grant. The other component is managed by the Energy Development Corporation Limited. This is a subsidiary institution of the Rwanda Energy Group, which is under the Ministry of Infrastructure. And the overall target or impact of the project is at least to have 500,000 Rwandan households benefiting to the clean cooking solution, and of course tier 2 plus. And of course, the overall population that will be benefited is set at 2.15. And of course, the objective of the project, not only basing on to contribute in the protection of environment, it will also specifically support in the reduction of the usage of charcoals in the urban areas and firewood in the rural areas. And as of today, we have about 170,000 households that already benefited to different clean cooking solutions through the subsidy scheme. So which shows really an impact of the subsidy to the increase of the pace of the implementation of the project. So the project also, its implementation is based on the operations manual, which is a document which contains all guidelines or all the policies that are ruling the implementations of the project. So, and of course, the document, this operations manual, is available on our website as well as other stakeholders. Next. Next. So as I said, this is the project implementation structure. As I said, this is a government project of Rwanda, represented by the Ministry of Infrastructure. And we basically have some technical committee and the steering committee. So basically, the role of the steering committee is to support in some critical situation the project may face, since the steering committee may provide the guidance on how to unlock those bottlenecks. So it is chaired by the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Infrastructure, and of course it includes the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning, Ministry of Environment, as well as of course the project implementation unit, represented by the CEO, Chief Executive Secretary of the Development Bank of Rwanda, Rwanda Energy Group, and the subsidiary institution, which is under the Rwanda Energy Group, as I said earlier, Energy Development Corporation Limited. Basically, this is the institution which is providing the technical assistance in terms of the verification of the eligible subsidy. And of course, the Rwanda Standard Board, this is contribute in testing the technologies to check their quality, if they are meeting the minimum technical specification required for the project. And also the local administrative entities development agents, LODA. This is basically representing the beneficiaries, Rwandans, and of course the hand of the Energy Private Developers Association, which is the umbrella of the participating companies. So I think next. So another part is the implementing agents and the technical advisor. So basically, the implementing agents, is the Development Bank of Rwanda with the support of the Energy Development Corporation Limited, and of course, BRD serves with not only serving as the. In addition to this, we are conducting some evaluation, the appraisal of the application for the companies that are willing to participate in the program. And of course, we are the one reporting to the committee, and we are also playing a big role of the coordination because they are external donors, they are beneficiaries, they are those companies that are participating in the project. So we are playing a role of the of the coordination along the environment, and also making the implementation, keeping the reporting. Basically, we are the one-stop center we are the focal point for the coordination in the implementation of this project. So, and of course, we have to disperse the eligible subsidy claimed by the participating companies after the verification of the Energy Development Corporation Limited. And of course, as of today, we have 19 grant subsidy agreement, which is equivalent to 9.3 billion Rwandan francs, almost $8 million approximately. So those are the number of the company. You can see that there is an uptake. So maybe you can proceed with the next slide. So for the Energy Development Corporation Limited, which is providing the technical assistance, basically they play a role of coordinating the stove testing, because I can call this to be the entrance door, the main entrance door for any company that is willing to participate in the project. So then it has to make sure that each and every stove to take a part of the program, it is tested and meeting the technical specification required by the program. And of course, it must have a cooperation agreement with the company, and also it maintains the tools, the monitoring tools, because this institution that keep the information on the access of the clean cooking products, and it of course support in the market facilitation activities. Entities involved in its responsibility is to provide the technical assistance. It conducts the awareness, and of course it has to control whenever a company fulfilled all the requirement and start the dissemination of the cook stoves. Whenever it has a sizable number to be claimed for the subsidy, this is the institution that is conducting the field verification, desk verification, phone verification, and after it report to the BRD for the disbursement. So next. So we are now joining the vital part of the component of the program, because if it is not properly done or prepared, it can cause a big effect to the project. So where the project may not have the uptake. So this is where I would really like to share our experience, so that you can have an understanding so on what we experienced. So basically here, whenever you are setting the subsidy, of course you have to conduct the market research, and there are two aspects, there are two parts, so you have to conduct a clear understanding on the need of the demand side. So here, the demand side represents the beneficiaries. You have to know what they want, what they need, what they can afford. You conduct a deep investigation to understand the reality on ground, and also try to understand or to conduct a kind of behavior change awareness campaign. And also at the supply side, you have to make sure that the technologies that are on the market are really going to contribute on your project. Are they really going to have an additional value that can help you to achieve the project objective? So basically, for us, we had first to to make sure that those how the side, the demand side are really how the existing relationship, business relationship, if I can call it, between the demand side and the supply side. And we have, before this project, we have realized that basically the challenge was the cost affordability. And this is where most of the products that were used, or cook stove or cooking ways, were remaining mostly traditional. So if I call traditionals, those are the stoves that are not really having higher efficiency, still having higher emission. Those are, those ones that are really not meeting the standard. So, and the challenge was here, the cost affordability. So this is where the subsidy level settings came in. Of course, through this project, this is where we have realized that the demand side was really have a need on the use of using the high, cleaner, the cleanest technology. So, and of course, at the supply side, sometimes you have to really be careful to avoid the market distortion, to make sure that also they are getting a margin, and of course to try to control the speculation, the price speculation. So and eventually we found that when we started the implementation of our RBF project, we have realized that there is a big uptake, a huge. The challenge was the cost affordability, and we have agreed with the support of the market facilitator after conducting the survey, and we agree on the subsidy, which is really fair, so that so I can see some question. I don't know if you allow me to finish with this slide and you go through it. So, and
yeah, Philbert, we can address the questions at the end. I will need to ask you to maybe speed up a little bit to get through all of the slides. So if we could speed through the rest of it, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you very much. And of course, the subsidy level we set, it was offering. Okay, thank you. So basically, in our program, we are under transitional, where we used to have the subsidy that was allocated based on the social category, and low income means the one to be highly subsidized, and the middle income and the higher income. So, however, now we are adopting a new approach of allocating the subsidy based on their tier categories. So means the cleanest one, the higher subsidized. So, and so far we have 54 cook stove approved, mostly belonging between the tier 2 and the tier 3. And of course, we have other cleanest cook stove falling under tier 4 and tier 5. So next. So this is the guiding principle. And whenever you are setting the subsidy, you have to make sure that the beneficiaries, both demand and supply side, understand that the product won't be fully paid. This is under cost sharing. And of course, the efficiency is to make sure that whenever you agree, you have to process in an efficient way. You have to be so fast. You have to be so fast in responding, in addressing. If there is any concern, make sure that you respond it effectively in a quick way. So the use of technology, those are the platform. Make sure that you properly keep the data for the beneficiaries. You set those eligibility tools and those clean cooking monitoring information system. And the transparency here means you have to make sure that every guiding principle or document related to the project is published on the where the both sides can be easily access them, such as those websites and other platforms. So, and also the quality control, you have to make sure that each and every product is meeting the standard. So this is where, for us, we are using the Rwanda Standard Board to make sure that the stove are very well tested. And also gender and social inclusion. So in our program, we have some indicators where at least 25% of female-headed households are benefiting under the program. So next, any other businesses? So those are some of the products eligible for our program. You can see we have pellet cook stoves. The cook stove that are using pellet, those are gasification-based technologies. We have those one biomass fuel that are falling under tier 2 and as well as tier 3. We have electrical cookers, we have LPGs. So I think those currently the product. Of course, we have a big list, another list where but we have selected this one at least for you to know what we are dealing with. So next. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Philbert, for that. We'll move on to our next speaker. So Michael Kelly is the Chief Advocacy Officer and Deputy Managing Director at the World LPG Association. He's going to talk to us about how some of the selection of subsidy design parameters, including the product selection issues and subsidy level issues that Philbert just mentioned, might influence the private sector actors and markets in different ways. So Michael, over to you.
All right, thank you, Colm. And let me thank the World Bank and the Clean Cooking Alliance for this invitation. We've been stakeholders with the Clean Cooking Alliance since it was the partnership of Clean Indoor Air, so going back quite a few years, and we've worked with the World Bank on a number of different projects over the years as well. Today, I'm going to focus on the impact of subsidies in the market, whether that is positive in growing markets or negative in creating distortions that disfigure and dampen growth in markets and then are very difficult to remove when they're put into place, or a little bit of both, which is what we have in a lot of markets. Next slide, please, Colm. The timing on this is really good because we just released a study. You see a quote from that here. This year, it was an effort by the WPGA and our membership, which is the global LPG industry, to recalibrate our position on subsidies. For years, we had opposed subsidies as a blanket, but we've changed that slightly, taking into account the reality that subsidies can be a tool in a toolbox to increase access to LPG, particularly in least developed markets. And that's where we see a lot of this, a lot of the activity around subsidies happening. Next slide, please. This was the document that was released. I can provide it to you if you're on this call upon request because it's paywalled on our website. And it includes some recommendations for policymakers and the industry as well. And we're going to have 4 case studies, which I'll be discussing today, of the 4 countries you see there. And those links are to free documents we have that are case studies of the various different LPG programs they have in those countries. The case studies are kind of divided. You have 2 successful case studies, India and Brazil, and then Morocco and Indonesia were successful in expanding access to LPG in both those countries, but have been less successful in that they have distorted the markets considerably. Next slide, please, Colm. And then as part of the work that we do, we've been also over the last couple of years organizing bilateral meetings between Indian government and industry with representatives of 2 African countries and regions. So Africa or Nigeria last year, and then just last month, in Joburg, we had a meeting with the Southern African Development Community. We brought a delegation of Indians over to try and see if the programs that have been launched in India since the Modi government could be grafted into an African context. And we'll do that next year in Brazil, where they're trying to expand access to LPG to rural Brazilians. Next slide, please. So the vast majority of subsidies today for LPG go to the household sector, which shouldn't be a surprise. About 50% of global consumption of LPG is for domestic consumption, so heating and cooking. In the developing world, that's even more pronounced. It's roughly 80%, and it's almost entirely for cooking, particularly in the global south. The number you see here, $35 billion, is very misleading. We think it's 3 or 4 times higher than that, given that subsidies can be delivered in a number of different ways. So there's a lot of money that is going into increasing access to LPG. At the moment, we anticipate that that's going to continue, given some of the statements that have been made recently by the IEA and some other influential stakeholders. Next slide. So what makes a responsible targeted subsidy? So first and foremost, and Philibert, I think, mentioned this a bit, or I think it was maybe Colm in his opening statements, is you have to have the private sector involved in the planning early to understand what the market will bear, to understand where the choke points are, to understand where the bottlenecks are. That's incredibly important. You need strong regulatory support. Having good regulations on the books is one thing, but having those regulations enforced is another, and that's somewhere where the government, the regulatory authority, and the industry can cooperate. Having appropriate targeting, so understanding which strata of the communities you're trying to target, society, and then trying to prevent seepage, which is also incredibly important and something that happens a lot in developing countries. And then whether you subsidize the fuel, so subsidize the amount of fuel consumed, or the product. So in many countries, the subsidy goes to a certain size cylinder, and only that size cylinder receives a subsidy. But then you start having people buying that cylinder, and instead of using it for consumption at home, they start using it for many different other applications or uses, or a combination of both. And we see a lot of different examples around the world. Next slide, please. So in terms of coordination with the private sector, one of the things that's really important to make sure that one of these programs is successful is having senior government involvement. In India, it was the Prime Minister Modi himself who was involved from the very beginning. In Indonesia, there's the Vice President. Currently today, the Second Lady of Ghana has been deputized to lead the clean cooking charge, and the First Lady of Kenya. That's really important so you can knock heads together at a ministerial level, knock out interministerial competition, and it sends a signal to the private sector that this is a priority for the government, and that's incredibly important. I touched on the independent regulatory authority, but also investments in key infrastructure. One of the biggest challenges in developing countries, and we see this all across Africa in particular, are the infrastructure bottlenecks, particularly ports and distribution capacity. So that's incredibly important to address in a way that makes sense. So either through the public sector, the private sector, or a combination of the two. And then ensuring that that infrastructure can be bulked out as the market grows. And then the last piece is the industry itself has to be professional, has to follow good practices, ensure that it's safe. And there has to be a little bit of tension between the government, the regulatory authorities, and the industry. And the industry should organize itself, some self-regulation, have a national association that's credible, that can be an interlocutor with the government. So all of that is incredibly important. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through these 4 case studies. There's lots of subsidies around the world. Morocco has one of the highest in the world. Ecuador has a very high LPG subsidy. But we're going to look at Brazil, India, Indonesia, and Morocco, and see what has been successful and what hasn't been successful. In general, India and Brazil have been successful. Indonesia and Morocco have been successful in expanding use, but now they're locked in with a subsidy, which they don't necessarily want. Next slide, please. So Brazil is one of the few countries in the world that put into place a subsidy, expanded growth, took the subsidy away, growth diminished a bit, but then it bounced back. And now it has the unsubsidized economy, except for a small slice called Bolsa, through a program called Bolsa Família, and an incredibly dynamic and competitive market, a big market, second biggest market in Latin America, where over 95% of Brazilians are currently cooking on LPG. So it's a great case study to look at how they did that, and why the market was so resilient. In India, there's a variety of initiatives under the PMUY or Ujwala scheme that was launched by the Modi government and has been an incredible logistical effort on the part of the government and the 3 PSUs. Today in India, over 90% of Indians have access to LPG. And some of the innovation they've used has been through leveraging biometrics and new technologies for things like direct benefit transfers so that you receive your subsidy directly into your bank account. So providing people with bank accounts, particularly people in the townships or slums around the big cities or in rural parts of India that had never had access to banking before. It's been a social change, a massive social change that's being looked at and copied around the world. The Give It Up campaign was also quite innovative. In order to get wealthy Indians who were benefiting from the subsidy give up their subsidy, they appealed to patriotism and they enlisted Bollywood stars and cricket stars to call on Indians in the middle class and the upper classes to give up their subsidy, and was incredibly successful. So that's something else that other markets are looking at. Next slide, please. And then in Indonesia, again, a huge switching program from kerosene this time between 2007 2010. They had a starter package, which they gave away with small cylinders to get over the first cost barrier, which can be a challenge for our industry. But the price gap between subsidized and non-subsidized cylinders means that wealthy consumers are getting the non-subsidized cylinders. And since they consume more, they're getting more benefit from the cylinders. It's also true that Indonesia is a complicated country for logistics, topographically difficult. And so rural India or Indonesians in remote parts of Indonesia are not benefiting from the cylinder or from the subsidy at all. So you've created this distortion in the market. Morocco has a different kind of problem. So the highest per capita per annum consumption globally, almost entirely for cooking, and the price is extremely low. And the subsidy benefits everyone, and it's a huge burden on the government, and the government therefore can't get rid of it because it would create political instability. Ecuador, my mother is Ecuadorian, and I visit Ecuador often. It also has a very high subsidy. And there, my cousins use LPG for heating their pools. They use LPG for heating, for everything you can possibly need because it's so cheap. And that's one of the distortions that gets created when you have a very high subsidy on this kind of product. It's happening in Morocco, it's happening in Ecuador, it's happening in a number of different countries. Next slide, please. So to conclude, increasing awareness or increasing access to LPG must be a government priority. So we're putting a program into place, making sure it has senior government buy-in is incredibly important, not only for the signal it sends to the market, but it does demonstrate a certain determination on the government side. Subsidies can be targeted to avoid benefits going to wealthier citizens, and you can do that using new technologies, biometrics, virtual banking. The new PAYGO systems pioneered in East Africa are going to help that as well. And then the private sector has to be brought in early. It's absolutely important that the private sector be brought in and be consulted so that we can bring to bear the muscle that we have in terms of distribution capacity and management techniques and an understanding of the market, so that the subsidy is well managed, well targeted, and well monitored as well for the long run. And those are my conclusions. So with that, last slide, Calm. I will invite you all, if you happen to find yourself in the wonderful city of Cape Town, in November of next year, we will have LPG Week, and the focus will be on African themes. I imagine we'll be having a big discussion about subsidies during that event. So thank you once again to the World Bank and to the Clean Cooking Alliance. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. And yeah, just a reminder to participants, please do enter your questions into the Q&A chat, and we'll come to those at the end. Thanks again, Michael. Finally, our next presenter is my colleague Pamela Lee from the Clean Cooking Alliance. She's going to take us through the design for a study to assess the effectiveness of subsidies and the ideal subsidy level to increase adoption of clean cooking in Kenya. So Pam, over to you.
Thanks, Colin. There's more than one way to assess what a subsidy level should be, but this is one way. It's using a discrete choice experiment, which is a pretty powerful methodology, and we're going to talk about a study that CCA is in the process of conducting right now for cook stoves. So you can do the subsidy with the product or with the fuel. You guys heard that already today. This one is particularly about the product. Go ahead, Colin, please. A little bit of background on conjoint analysis, which is what a discrete choice experiment is a type of conjoint. Conjoints allow you to model choice decisions and how people make their decisions, which involves trade-offs when it comes to products. So for example, they may pay a higher price to get a certain feature that they're looking for, or they give up a certain feature in order to get a lower price. So it's those trade-off decisions and the decision heuristics that people use to make decisions that are really hard to get at in other ways. So that's what a conjoint can do for you. So it's a market research approach. It's used very broadly now in market research on products specifically, because it allows you to mimic those real world trade-off decisions. So it can uncover consumer preferences about products to predict whether they would adopt or not. It's used broadly to gauge price sensitivity and help to set certain price levels. And it allows you to choose, it allows an organization or an enterprise to choose the optimal set of features and levels of those features as they're putting a product into the market, or in this case, subsidizing the product. And then you can predict market share, or in this case, we would want to be predicting adoption rates. Go ahead, Colin. So as I mentioned, a discrete choice experiment is one type of conjoint, and it's one that shows respondents to a survey theoretical model choices with finite sets of options. And it would iterate through several different choices. For example, a respondent might see a question like what you're looking at now, and then say 10 more like this, where the different attributes and levels of those attributes are changing, and they're having to make those trade-off decisions. So we're showing an example of a purchase or potential TVs that someone might choose from. And what's varying in these is the brand of the TVs, the screen size, whether or not it's a smart TV, and then the price. And so they have to choose one of these, or say, I would not choose any of these. So one respondent might, for example, say, I only buy Samsung products. Even though it's a higher price, they're going to select that one. Someone else might say, it has to be a smart TV. So I'm going to narrow it down right away to the smart TVs and then make my choice between those two. So each respondent has a different set of decision heuristics that help them make decisions. And then we would get what's most important to each respondent. And then more broadly, when you combine that, you get what's most important and how people make decisions for the entire market. So a survey designer will determine the number of attributes that they're going to test and the different levels of those attributes. You can see those levels listed at the bottom of the slide here. And often there are survey software that allows you to do discrete choice experiments, and often it will tell you, based on what sample size you're expecting to get, how many questions each respondent needs to see in order for you to get the sample that you need to get your good results out of it. So so hopefully you have that kind of software. If you don't, it's possible to do that hand calculation, but it's a difficult calculation. And then on the back end of this, when you're analyzing it, there's a very powerful analysis that usually it's hierarchical Bayesian regression that gives you the results. And that's probably a little too in the weeds for most people, but just to say it's much more powerful than a linear regression model. Go ahead, Colin. So what you get from doing a discrete choice experiment is a calculation of the preference score or the utility score for each of the attributes and the levels that you tested. So if you look at this example on the left, this is actually talking about cell phones. You can see that when you're talking about price, very clearly, everyone wants the lower price. When you're talking about data, everyone wants more data. That's not surprising, but what is powerful here is, first of all, understanding that the data included seems to have the largest range, meaning that is a huge decision factor for people whereas the number of international minutes that they get is much lower on the scale, much less impactful in their decision making. And then you can build a simulator with these results. So for example, while we know that everybody wants the lowest price, what happens if price is restricted to say $50 per month, and then you can see how these levels shift and where the preferences go. So you can use that simulator to create a different combinations of features and see what happens then to market share. Or in the case of subsidy research, we can see what happens at different subsidy levels, different types of subsidies, and see how that impacts adoption or uptake. Go ahead, Colin. So the research that CCA is in the process of conducting is a survey, and it's being conducted in an urban area and a rural area of Kenya, so Nairobi and Isiolo specifically. And we're walking, I'm not going to get into the exact details of what changes with each of those, but I'll walk through some examples of what some of these surveys look like in the different areas. Both of them, however, go through the same sort of outline with demographic and behavioral questions in the beginning. And here you would want to include anything that you might want to segment your results by. So obviously we would look at rural versus urban. We might want to look at different levels of income and try to create some sort of overall indicator of income and see how that affects the results of the study, members in the household, and so on. You would have selection criteria. For example, in the urban area in Nairobi, we are only surveying people that don't currently use LPG because the study is focused on uptake of an LPG stove. So you'd have the selection criteria that makes the discrete choice experiment meaningful and doesn't introduce confounds. And then you have to ask some questions and sometimes give some information before jumping into the discrete choice experiment. In our case, we wanted to capture awareness and understanding of various clean cooking solutions, as well as various subsidy types. So for example, before we ask someone about or how a cash transfer might impact their decision, we need to make sure that they know what that means. Same thing with vouchers and so on. Also making sure that they understand what the stove is, and you might even want to introduce some of the benefits of an LPG stove that they might not be aware of. And then you get into the discrete choice experiment, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And then finally, for our research, we wanted to then go into identifying some of the barriers and some of the benefits or levers that people weigh in their decision that you can't necessarily put into the discrete choice experiment, but we want to understand what's in the way of people adopting and what are people drawn to when it comes to the decision to adopt. And then prioritizing what those values are. So while this is not a study designed to do message testing, it would help us in the next phase of research to understand what value people are looking for, what benefits people are looking for. And then finally, an external validity check, because it's very easy for people to say, yes, I think that it's important to help the environment or the health of my family. But when it comes right down to it, and whether or not they would actually purchase something, there's a way that you can do a validity check on that. Okay, Colin, go ahead. I'm going to show you some parts of our actual survey. So skipping over the demographics and behavioral question, going into the part of the survey that is sort of preempting the discrete choice analysis, discrete choice experiment. We asked people their familiarity with, in this case, an LPG gas stove, showing a picture of it. There's some benefits listed on there. For example, they emit less emissions, no smoke, safer than the traditional cook stoves or cooking on fire, and asking them just kind of up front, do you know where to buy one? Do you know how much they would normally cost? Things like that. So what this is, we're getting some information out of this, but it really is kind of serving as an educational piece of the survey, so that when they get to the discrete choice experiment, they understand more about what they're being asked questions about. Go ahead. Similarly, we do the same thing with the different types of subsidies that we're going to test in the discrete choice experiment. This is showing an example of the information about vouchers. So there's a section in there that introduces and defines what a voucher is, asks if they're familiar with it, asks if they feel like they understand how it works. If they say no, we'll give some more information to make sure that they do understand this. And then we ask if they've ever used a voucher to make a purchase before. So when they go into the DCE, they should understand what a voucher is, as well as the other types of subsidies that we're testing. Colin, go ahead. So now you're going to see what we are including in the discrete choice experiment. The attributes are, you can see across the top, the price of the cook stove. In this case, we are testing the stove plus a 6 kilogram cylinder of LPG, so that as a package up front, they're getting what they need to begin using the LPG stove. And so the price is listed, including the stove and the cylinder. And then the total is what changes. The price of the stove is what changes. The cylinder price does not, but we're giving them the total price there. We're varying the subsidy modality from voucher to cash payment to a discount through the third party. And then we have two choices for financing mechanism. We either are giving them the option to pay the lump sum up front, or to do a micro loan where the payments are spread out equally across 4 months. And this essentially is just sort of removing the barrier of too big of an upfront cost, or for people who don't like the idea of doing a micro loan, they can still do the upfront cost. And then the subsidy amount will be displayed to them as an amount, but calculated on the back end as a percentage. And so if they're shown, for example, the first pricing option where the total is 5,500, the software will calculate what are the various percentages of that, and that would be the subsidy amount that the respondent sees. And you can see they vary from 20% to a very high subsidy of 80%. This is because in the case of LPG, a lot of times stoves are sometimes even given to respondents, and then because there is that ongoing cost of fuel that they may not have had to pay for before. I should specify though, in this experiment, we are only including people who are not currently using LPG, but are currently paying for fuel, so that we are not introducing a completely new cost to them, ongoing cost to them. They're used to having some ongoing cost of fuel. Go ahead, Colin. This is what it would look like to respondents as they're taking the survey. So you can see on the left-hand side, it's introducing this is the price, the subsidy type, financing, which is just micro loan or no financing, and then the subsidy amount, which again is not shown as a percentage, but an actual dollar amount. And then they could choose neither of these. And so we would walk respondents through several set of choices. Depending on what sample size we're expecting to get, will determine how many of these they would actually see. But let's just say they might see 7 or 10 of these, where they're looking at these and making those trade-off decisions for which product they would choose, always with the option of none of these. Go ahead, Colin. And then very quickly, I mentioned that we are testing some barriers and benefits to these, just to better understand how people are making their decisions, what might be levers we could pull, what might be standing in the way, and so on. As a precursor to message testing, we had previously in the survey introduced some of the benefits of clean cooking solutions, for example, health of the family, environmental benefits, and so on. So they would have learned what those benefits are. And then now we're asking, this is a max diff is actually a different type of conjoint. We're asking them, of all these benefits that you have been introduced to that come along with clean cooking solutions, which one is most important to you? Which one is least important to you? This really forces people to make, again, a trade-off decision, as opposed to just giving them, for example, a Likert scale where we say, how important is this to you? And you get that ceiling effect of most people saying it's all important. And then you have no way of differentiating that. This forces a trade-off decision, and you can see the results on the right-hand side for what is most important to the group, and that starts to help you understand what type of messaging should go along with a subsidy. Colin, go ahead. And finally, the validity check. And this is just one question that comes at the end. So at this point, they would have gone through the entire survey, made those trade-off decisions, learned a lot, and now we actually want to say, okay, given all that you've learned about LPG cook stove, subsidy options, the benefits of clean cooking, imagine that you were offered a subsidy for 50% of the upfront cost of a stove with a cylinder in your preferred subsidy type and payment amount. Would you purchase the LPG cook stove within the next year? Yes or no? And this helps us to take, if let's say 50% say no, we can apply that to the results of this discrete choice experiment and say, does this match what people are saying? Or in the DCE, were they more likely to adopt or to select something than say neither of these? This allows us to sort of weight or temper the results that we get to a more realistic scenario. With this question, people are generally going to answer pretty truthfully. And then final slide, Colin, and I know we're running out of time for questions. Apologies for that. Essentially, I've kind of gone over all this. We're going to learn the ideal subsidy type and amount, preferred delivery modality, and we'll be able to quantify barriers and benefits and see what kind of adoption rate we could expect by using that simulator tool and varying different things. Also get results segmented how you want in different regions, different types of cook stoves and income levels and so on. So I've gone a few minutes past my time. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So Colin, back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Pam. Let's jump into some of the questions then. So the first one that we have, so this is directed to Michael. Michael, so the question is, should discussion about subsidizing products like the clean cook stoves that were presented by Filbert in Rwanda, should that discussion be as high profile as in the cases of India and Brazil? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, I'm going to give you a politician's answer, which is to answer without answering, because the reality is it depends on the market and the market structure. I would think, you know, I would think there's less risk of lock-in if you're subsidizing products themselves than if you're subsidizing the fuels. But I have never seen any kind of study on that or any kind of discussion about that. And I would submit to the end user subsidies lab that this might be an incredibly interesting area for study. So if you're thinking about your action plan 2024, this might be something that would be really interesting to understand, because it would allow you to better target your subsidies. If you know that there's a bigger risk of lock-in in one way than the other, it allows you to prepare for that. So I challenge end user subsidies lab to take this up. How about that for a politician's answer?
Nice one. Great, thanks, Michael. And the next one, maybe for maybe Michael, you can share thoughts on this, and Filbert, too, curious whether there's any either consideration here in Rwanda or if you've thought about this. So the question was why are institutional or commercial vendors excluded? In terms of the question, it's specifically on LPG subsidies, but maybe thinking more broadly about subsidies for institutional or commercial users. The person asking the question highlights that, you know, these vendors and institutions are cooking for many people on a daily basis, a large source of cooking activity. So how do we think about commercial, institutional users, vendors, etc. when we think about subsidies? Michael, any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, look, this is an excellent question. So if you think about hospitals or schools, barracks, prisons, anywhere you have these big institutional kitchens, and if you can substitute the LPG for any form of biomass, you have massive savings in biomass usage and positive health and environmental impacts as well. But in the past, up until now, when subsidies are put into place, are often seen as a social good, and they're targeted more at homes, with the benefit going specifically to households. That's the way LPG's been, at least from the LPG world, that's the way it's been seen in the past. And that's certainly the thinking behind, say, India or Brazil or even Morocco, when they structured their subsidies. It was specifically for people cooking at home. And then commercial entities were seen as either able to pay higher rates to cook with LPG, or not as big a priority for the government when they structured those subsidies.
Mm-hmm. Philbert, have you thought about, or how do you think about subsidies for institutional users in Rwanda?
Yes, thank you very much, Com. So there is another project under the implementation of our stakeholder, Energy Development Corporation Limited, which is mainly focusing on the institutional cooking, including schools. I think now there is a pilot that will expected to help mainly at the side of the technologies to address the cost affordability, but not providing the subsidy to the fuel. So it is there, and we believe soon to start getting some result. And for sure, there is a big concern with the institutional since the institutions, since most of them they are still using the biomass, and it is not really, as Michael said, environmental friendly, and it is also costing too much. So having higher efficiency technologies that can use alternative solutions such as LPG will really respond to the challenge, to the problem of the clean cooking solution adaptation in the institution. So for sure, there is a project in pipeline.
Great. Thanks, Philbert. Pam, a question for you. So one of our participants is wondering when the results of the first studies will be available. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, we are within a couple weeks of launching. We're just kind of waiting on the final IRB steps, and then we will be in the field for about 3 weeks is what we're expecting. So I think you can, if you watch CCA's website and LinkedIn, you'll start seeing results probably within the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Okay, great. And another question that came through was, I understand from this presentation, an exit strategy is extremely important. What's the determining factor in drafting and executing a successful exit strategy? That's the answer to that question would take an entire webinar in itself. And in fact, we will have an entire webinar on that topic on December 6th. So stay tuned for that. We'll be going into plenty of detail on exit strategies. I think we're almost out of time. I'm just going to jump quickly to make a plug for our next webinar, which will focus on the delivery of subsidy programs. Registration is open at the link on the screen. That webinar is going to be on the 9th of November. So please do go and register for that webinar, and of course for the following one on exit strategies. As I said, we're interested in your feedback on this webinar, any questions that you have that we didn't get to, or any thoughts and input on the framework itself as we're sharing this over this webinar series. And of course, we're always interested in the opportunity to collaborate and share insights, have more great suggestions like Michael's suggestion for our 2024 research. So do reach out to us if you have any questions or experiences to share with this broader community of practitioners interested in designing better demand-side subsidies for energy access. With that, I want to thank Philbert, Michael, and Pam for taking the time to share their experiences and thoughts with us. And thanks to the End User Subsidy Lab team for all of the support in the background. Really great having you all here today, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.